next panel, and you see how fortunate I am. All I have to just look in the right direction, and here the other panelist just appears ready to go. And Tasha, are we all set with Brad online? So this is going to be our first genuinely hybrid program. So far, all day today, everyone has been in person. Now that we're in the afternoon, we have a number of panels in which some of the panelists are coming in from Zoom. So now we're going to find out if this actually works. So, right, absolutely. You're going to be the desk gaze. So this panel, as you see on your program, this is our discussion of the newly minted, just signed into law by President Biden on December 29th, the Unleashing American Innovation Act. And our panelists today, we have with us right here in person, Scott Wilson, who is now Director of Government Affairs at Spotify. But back then, you had a different role, and what were you doing back then?
So back then, I was Senior IP Policy Advisor to Chairman Lateef on the Intellectual Property Subcommittee on the Senate Judiciary.
Okay. And we also have with us online Bradley Watts, Vice President for Patents and Innovation Policy, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Global Innovation Policy Center. And Brad, do we have you?
Yes, but my camera is not working for some reason.
And it's our loss because, I mean, he just looks fabulous, simply fabulous. And Brad, what were you doing at the time that this bill was working its way up through the ranks?
Well, thanks for the compliment. If you could see how I looked, you would probably regret that statement. But at the time, I was Scott's counterpart, but for Senator Tillis, so handling intellectual property issues for the senator alongside overseeing his Senate Judiciary Committee team.
Excellent. So now, in your materials, for those of you who have not actually looked at the text of the new law, we've included it in your materials so you can actually see what this is. It's a nice short act. I mean, it got a little bit buried in the big, what's the large one that it's a part of?
Yeah, the Omnibus, the Omnibus Appropriations Act.
Yeah, and that's like something like, what, 1,600 pages long?
It's a lot.
Yeah. But, we get to the heart of it, right? And so it's a fantastic deck. And I guess the first question that I want to ask of both Scott and Brad, how did this bill come about? I mean, we have seen some prior legislative efforts to sort of deal with the fact that perhaps as a nation, we aren't exploiting all of the innovative and creative talent that we have, such as things as the Success Act and some others. But this really is the first act that takes an unprecedented affirmative approach to not just get information and to sort of think about it, but what are some specific things that we can do. So I'm very interested. I'm sure everyone is here. How did this even come about as a bill in the first place? Let's start with you, Scott.
Yeah. So heading into that Congress last year, last Congress, Senator Lateef had just taken over the chairmanship of the subcommittee, but he had previously been chairman of the full committee, and I've been part of his IP team at the time. It was the 10-year anniversary of the Leahy-Smith American Invents Act. So we were actively thinking about ways we could help build on that law. And, there were a lot of different components to that, some more controversial than others. But one of the things that really jumped out to me as something that we could really run with and potentially even make a law with is building on the access provisions of the AIA, right? So it created satellite offices, created a patent pro bono program. It was really one of the first pieces of legislation in the IP space that tried to make the system more accessible, that tried to reach innovators where they were, as opposed to having them all come to the central office in Alexandria. So that was really one of for me, what could we do, right? What could we do further? The satellite offices, I think, were a wild success, and I think everybody thought that they were. There were regions of the country that were not covered. And then there was also, I think, a lot of thinking about the education components, right? Yes, we created a patent pro bono program, but did people know about it? This was one of the core questions that we had. and what were the ways to get out in the community to kind of, again, meet innovators where they were, so they didn't have to come to some one big office that covered maybe 6 states in a region, where there are ways to get more micro-targeted with it. So that was the sort of general impetus for it. And again, look, I'll be totally honest, we wanted to find a way to make a law, and this really felt like a good way to approach achieving both that goal and building on the goals of the AIA.
Yeah, great. And Brad, from your perspective, how did we get to this bill, even just getting off the ground?
Yeah, and again, sorry, I keep fiddling with my camera, but it's not working. So I guess you just get, I'm like the Wizard of Oz today. You get the voice behind the smoke screen. Look, I can't claim any credit or recognition for the ideas behind this bill, right? This is all Senator Leahy and Scott's baby. But I can tell you why it was something Senator Tillis was interested in. Senator Tillis, has long been a believer and supporter of kind of inclusive, not just innovation, but workforce issues, going back to his days when he was at PricewaterhouseCoopers, back to his days at IBM. He actually started a practice within the group to recruit from HBCUs, right? He recognized there was untapped talent and potential that would make his companies better, right? I mean, we say diversity, right? And we just think, oh, it's a nice buzzword, but as we all know, right, having increased inclusion leads to better economic outputs, better thought processes, better products. And, Senator Tillis was, at the forefront of that, even in his private sector days. So when he became chairman of the IP subcommittee, that was something he was keenly attuned to and interested in, right? How do we get more innovators in the pipeline, people from traditionally underrepresented communities, right? Whether that be racially underrepresented communities, ethnically, socioeconomic, veterans, et cetera. And so, when Senator Leahy and his team, Scott, approached Senator Tillis about this was a no-brainer, talking about how do we increase inventor diversity? How do we increase outreach? How do we give inventors, particularly underrepresented inventors, more resources? That checked all of Senator Tillis's boxes. And so we can't claim credit, I'm not with the senator anymore. I don't speak for him. I don't think Senator Tillis would try to claim credit for the bill. It obviously was Senator Leahy's baby, but it fit in line with all of his kind of value sets about how we can promote inclusive innovation and the benefit that will have for us as a country. And I think that's why he was so eager to work with Senator Leahy on that bill.
Well, Lateef, one thing I would add too is one area where I think Senator Tillis can help take some credit is really leading on these issues in the previous Congress. I think he really took a lot of steps and worked with Senator Hirono in particular in trying to drive these issues home. So without that groundwork, I'm not sure we could have pushed this forward as quickly as we did. Brad.
Well, actually, what the two of you just laid out may answer an even more pressing question that we all have been thinking about in the last several years. How did you get this to be a bipartisan bill? Because we don't seem to be able to do that a whole lot. So what's the magic ingredient that made this happen and happen in this way?
Well, I think one of the first magic ingredients is having a great staffer like Brad to work with. I think having another leader like Senator Tillis, who's willing to sort of take a degree of risk within his caucus on these issues. They've just become more controversial than maybe they need to be in some ways within the Republican conference. But I think IP issues in general have always been, I think we can say, nonpartisan in some ways. The lines in Congress where they break down are completely different from the Republican and Democratic lines that we're used to seeing in any other space. And I think there is a hunger on the Senate Judiciary Committee for all the combat that happens, and that's only gotten worse with sort of judicial nominations and very bloody Supreme Court nominations to find, proactive spaces where they can actually work together. And this is really one of those few oases where that does happen. So I think it was a natural place to look in the IP space. And again, it's generally he only really wants to do things in a bipartisan way. And when he's very serious about doing legislation, my instructions are always find me a Republican, right? Like I don't want to do something that is just with my side. And so you've got to be willing to make compromises. But honestly, we didn't have to make a ton of compromises thanks to Senator Tillis and Brad.
Brad?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would just echo what Scott said about it takes good partnerships, right? Not just between the senators, but between staff. And we were really lucky from the Tillis office that, we got to have great partnerships with the Leahy team, not just on this, but there were issues where our bosses were very far apart and they were able to come to kind of agreement on things because they were fair, they were reasonable, the staff had good relationships, and we were willing to all be thoughtful, right? I mean, if you look, and I know this panel isn't about this, but if you look at Senator Leahy and Tillis's bill on PTAB reform, they initially started in very different places, but through thoughtful dialogue, engagement, collaboration, willing to compromise, they came up with a really good product. And so it's a testament to Scott's point about not only the member level relationships, but the willingness of staff on complex issues like intellectual property to be wonky, to be thoughtful, to be engaged. And so, every compliment Scott gave us is equally applicable to Senator Leahy and his team. And then, about the specific question of, why now? I think, one of the great things about inclusive innovation, and I really give Director Vidal credit for kind of pushing how we frame this as being about inclusive innovation. I think one of the reasons why it's resonating with legislators, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, conservative, liberal, is I think there's an increasing realization, right, that we're in a global kind of economic competition, right? We're in a position where there's a very real question of not only which country, but which type of kind of model and regime is going to lead the world in emerging technologies. Is it going to be a country like the United States that has values related to democracy, human rights, freedom, open access, or is it going to be a different type of regime? And I think because of that, policymakers realize if we're going to continue for this to be, an American century, and we're going to set kind of global standards and have, the values I think we all believe in be the global norm, we have to be the world's global innovator. And that's going to take everyone, right? And when we don't have innovators engaging, people who are smart, who are talented, who have great ideas because they don't have the resources or they don't know how to access, the relevant government agency, or because for a number of reasons they're, economically, socially, disadvantaged, right? That's a failure on our part to tap into potential that could really change the world. I mean, Scott brought up work we had done in the previous Congress, but I mean, I remember in one of our hearings in 2019, we had the late now Dr. Barbara Galt there to testify, and listening to her talk about the barriers she faced just to get into the patent system with her kind of revolutionary work. It really, in my boss's mind at the time, made him think, well, what if we had been able to break those barriers down so that instead of spending so much time just trying to break in, she could have spent more time innovating and changing the world. And so I think most policymakers get that, right? That the more inclusive our innovation system is, the better it is. And especially at this time of heightened geopolitical tensions, we need every American who wants to innovate to be able to innovate. And not innovating shouldn't be because there are barriers. It should be because they want to do something else.
And while there are so many things that we can disagree upon in our society, IP is one of the things that we can all agree upon, right? It's because IP is not a zero-sum game, right? If you innovate, I can look at your innovation and then decide I'm going to take it in another direction, right? And I see that by virtue of learning from what you have done, right? If you write a song that expresses what I say to my students is the idea behind 90% of popular music, baby, I love you, right? Baby, why'd you leave me? Baby, come back, right? Okay. But just right there, we see that there are so many different ways to express the same idea. And so as a result, it's not a zero-sum game. It is something that everybody can jump into the pool. And the fact that you have gotten there first is not a barrier to me coming in second. As a matter of fact, I can build upon what you've done. And this is the way that we can all get together and compete so much more effectively on a global scale. Well, by the time I saw some of the initial drafts of the bill, it was very clear that you all had done some really extensive research and had covered a great deal. And then you conducted the hearing before the Judicial Subcommittee. How did the testimony and the proceedings at the hearing, how did that contribute to further developing your understanding of the issues and how Congress might develop and pass legislation to address these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly informative, the hearing that we had. And we were really lucky. I mean, one of the things that you have to do when you're in my role or you're in Brad's role is represent your state. So we did have to go to Vermont and try to find a good witness who could talk about these issues in Vermont. We really struck gold with who we found. You know, we only talked to maybe 2 or 3 people. We found Georgia Grace Edwards, who was a young woman who had taken an entrepreneurship class at Middlebury, and she came up with this idea and really talked to us about the barriers that she found. When we were interviewing her as a witness, the first thing she said was, did you encounter any barriers? And she said, I encountered 3 main barriers. One was a representation barrier, one was a knowledge barrier, and one was an economic barrier. And so that really, from there, she expanded on what all of that meant, right? Now, she had designed some clothing and sort of an innovative sort of apparel for women. She was trying to go around when she was going around to lawyers, trying to, find somebody to help her shepherd this through the process. They weren't understanding what she was talking about. And so just from right there, there was an immediate barrier of understanding what this product was. That was, very telling, right? That you can't even get into the system if you can't find somebody to help you navigate it. Right. Beyond that, she found that this system was incredibly difficult for her to figure out how to navigate in general, right? I mean, this is somebody who's, reasonably well-resourced. She's in college. She, is in an entrepreneurship class, and she still can't quite figure out what she's supposed to do. So there's that knowledge barrier. And then there's the economic barrier, right? She was spending, of this small company that she was trying to create, 50% of her revenue was going into the legal fees and everything that she needed to try to get this off the ground. And she was having to make decisions. Am I going to invest money in, the materials that I need to produce this product? Am I going to, or where are these resources going to go? And honestly, for her, at first, she did not think that the patent was the place where those resources should go, despite knowing that in the long term, that was what was going to yield the most revenue. But I think what she found is that once she got the patent, it conveyed this degree of legitimacy that was critical to her business. And I think that's something that she did not necessarily realize, again, with the knowledge barrier and all of that. So I think that was one of the sort of core testimonies that really informed this bill. I think other testimony that we heard that to me was impactful was, again, the idea that we had created a lot of these systems and assistance programs in the AIA and in other places, and people didn't know that they existed. Senator Leahy directly asked Georgia Grace Edwards, did you know that there was a patent pro bono program? And she said, no, and I wish I had known that. So that was really so that as we were, I'm sitting there writing this down and saying, okay, this is what we need to be doing with this bill.
Yeah. Brett?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Scott said. I mean, I remember at the time, my kind of key takeaways were really twofold. Number one, we had a number of folks on this panels who, to Scott's point, were well-resourced, or at least well-positioned, right, to be well-resourced and well-educated about these opportunities, and they weren't aware of them, right? And, I remember thinking to myself, well, gosh, if these folks don't know about these programs or have access to resources or can access the resources that we have, think about folks who are facing all sorts of additional barriers, right? The single mom who is working 2 jobs but has this real innovative idea. Not only does she face, lack of knowledge maybe about programs, resource issues, but then she has to figure out how to navigate this complex government bureaucracy. And that's not a knock on the PTO, right? That's just the nature of any agency. And so that was kind of striking, right? Extrapolating this out to folks who weren't as in a privileged position as some of our witnesses were at the time. And that's not to undermine the struggles they faced, but it really puts into perspective, right, that there is more to be done. And we have to be really cognizant of how, again, we get folks into the system and help them overcome those barriers. Because, I mean, again, the perspective I think about is, take the single mom working 2 jobs, struggling to make ends meet, but she has this real innovative idea. She doesn't know about programs or resources that are available. She's having to navigate this complex system. We all know just from our daily lives, I would probably give up. And, I'm fortunate to not to have those struggles right now. So, I mean, that to me, I think was a really valuable perspective. And I think one of the great things too is I think there was broad consensus among our witnesses, the members that attended the hearing. I mean, this was not a hearing where people came in and there was, contention, right? I mean, I think there was kind of a universal kumbaya that no, this is a problem. These are just kind of evident facts and we need to do something about it. And to Scott's point, I think that's why we didn't have to do a ton of changes to the bill. We made some tweaks here and there, but, on a whole, I think for most policymakers and their staff, this is just good common sense. And we all know, right? We all have constituents that face these type of struggles and barriers, and they shouldn't have to when they might have that next big thing that could change the world.
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me again about her testimony was that to go back to it was one of the just sort of communication barriers was the fact that it was very difficult for her to find a woman patent lawyer. And that was one of the big obstacles that as she was trying to explain to patent lawyers, okay, this is why this, and well, we may as well disclose it as politely as we can. At the apparel, it was, okay, we all like to go hiking. Well, I don't, but people do. And it was, you may be hiking and there comes the time in the forest when you have to go to the bathroom. And she designed clothing that would better accommodate when a woman is in that situation. And that's what you were getting at, that there were, the men patent attorneys that she was meeting with and talking to, they couldn't get it. They couldn't understand what, and how is this innovative, right? Doesn't all clothing, work that way? And so the diversity of the patent bar in that regard was an important factor.
Absolutely. There was one other witness who was incredibly useful and impactful. And we actually wrote an entire section of the bill thanks to his testimony. He's sitting right next to me. It's Lateef.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I will add that it was quite an experience because this was during the height of COVID. And so the other 4 witnesses, they were all present virtually. So I was the only one in a room of these imposing and intimidating, senators in a room that was meant for a bunch of witnesses, a bunch of people, and there's just this echo, and I just felt very small and humble.
Well, one thing I will say though, and Scott can attest to this as a former staffer, nothing is more intimidating to staffers, and I would imagine the senators, than having a seasoned academic in front of them, because well, we also can get intimidated by the breadth of knowledge. So don't cut yourself short.
Yes, thank you. Well, speaking then of the act itself, we can each chime in here. Is there any particular provision or provisions in the act as passed that is a special favorite of yours, or something you think is particularly unique or particularly unprecedented, or you think will be uniquely effective?
Yeah, for me, it's the community outreach offices that are in this. I mean, this was building on the idea that it was great to have satellite offices, but they had multiple functions. In my view, it was necessary to create something smaller that was really sort of almost, I was thought about it as a hub and spoke, right? Where the satellite office would be the hub, then you would have the spoke going out there to meet people really, again, where they were. And Lateef, I think your testimony talked a lot about the importance of meeting folks where they are. So these outreach offices, I think there's only 4 mandated, but we hope that this will be a successful part of this program going forward. Because I think, again, we really need to make sure that prospective inventors understand the resources that are there, that are available to them. Because we know, again, that we see this again and again, that they don't. And so I think trying to reach people where they are, trying to get into different parts of the country that were not represented before. We happened to put one in Northern New England, but that was purely accidental. But there are definitely there are lots of parts of the country that need this, and so I think that I'm most hopeful that will be impactful going forward.
Yeah. Brad, for you?
I agree with Scott 100%. And again, I think it's just from the perspective of access, right? And again, I think about, say you're an inventor on the ground in an area that doesn't have a satellite office or a regional office. You have this great idea, but you're struggling to navigate. Maybe you've heard of PTO, right? Maybe you even heard peripherally about some of these programs, but you're struggling to navigate it because we all know how complex these things are. So, if you don't have a satellite office or a regional office, right, your options are find the money to go talk to a patent attorney, which again, if you're already facing barriers, good luck. Or, call up the main USPTO office, which again, that in itself can be a hassle. We all know the process of trying to navigate getting someone on the phone anywhere at any place. It's just the nature of a large organization versus, hey, there's your local community outreach office that is housed in the local law school 10 miles down the road. Drive down there and just show up and talk to someone. I mean, that can be a real game changer for someone who may already be feeling overwhelmed by what seems like an impossible to navigate system. And so I agree with Scott. I mean, having these offices in key areas where you can talk to a person, doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but we're all reasonably sophisticated actors. For the folks who are already overwhelmed by trying to get their invention finalized, trying to figure out the patent system, trying to just figure out the next thing to do, something as simple as talking to a real live person in their community could make all the difference between giving up and again, bringing that next big thing into the system so that society can benefit.
And what I would add, because I agree with both of you that was also for me one of the most important provisions. And just to share with our attendees here and both physically here and online, let me just read a quick quote from the act itself that addresses the purposes of the community outreach offices. And it says that, one, to further the purposes described in the America Invents Act. And then it goes on to say, partner with local community organizations, institutions of higher education, research institutions, and businesses to create community-based programs that provide education regarding the patent system, promote the career benefits of innovation and entrepreneurship, and educate prospective inventors, including individual inventors, small businesses, veterans, low-income populations, students, rural populations, and any geographic group of innovators that the director may determine to be unrepresented in patent filings, all about public and private resources available to potential patent applicants, including the patent pro bono program. So you can see that they crafted a very targeted bill that identified, here's the problem, here's specifically how we're gonna solve it. And then, one other provision in addition to that I also thought caught my eye, I was very excited about, was providing for the creation of another regional office, and this one in the southeast portion of the United States. And that was of particular interest because, the southeast portion of the United States includes Georgia, Georgia includes Atlanta, and we know there's an awful lot of HBCU activity down in Atlanta. So I thought that was another wonderful part. You can see this is a very well-crafted provision. This is just the epitome of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, right? The people come, they say this is what we need, and then they got together and they actually wrote it, and then the president signed it into law. So now we have.
Well, one thing can I add about the list you read that I'm particularly happy about, and I want to give kudos to colleagues on the committee besides our two bosses, but the inclusion and recognition of veterans, right? Several offices. And then again, this goes to show you how important this topic is. Several offices on both the Republican and Democratic side, and when reviewing this bill, they were like, we want to see veterans included here. So many vets come out, they have really technical specialized skills because of the work they're doing. They have a lot of great ideas, but we all know veterans face a number of challenges, right? And so to your point and to Scott's point about this being an issue where there's a lot of broad consensus, I was so impressed and thankful that offices were engaging and not just thinking about inclusive innovation in terms of race or gender or region, but also, vets groups, other kind of underrepresented groups. And I think ultimately it made a stronger bill because, again, when we talk inclusive innovation, the more people we get, no matter their background, the better that's going to be for us as a country.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so now in the 5 minutes that we have left, so now we've got the act, we have the directive, we have the goal. Any final thoughts that you might each care to share about now, how do we actually go forward and implement, take these provisions and make particular things happen? Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll go back to the community outreach offices again. I mean, I think making sure that, again, there's only 4 that are required. I hope that they will consider more. I hope that they will really consider carefully where they go, because I think what I would like to not see again is a major gap in the way that we had in the Southeast, right, with the satellite offices. And this is no sort of meant to knock the PTO in any way. It's just to say, I think it would be critical to make sure that you're really leveraging these offices in the way that's the most useful and the most impactful by reaching corners of the country that otherwise might go untouched.
Brad?
I would agree. I mean, I think in terms of implementation and oversight, looking at 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out, what are the impacts of these outreach offices? So trying to quantify that in terms of not only the number of people who visited the office, but what type of regional engagements are those offices doing? Meaning, and Scott, correct me if I'm speaking out of turn, but I think when we thought about these outreach offices, we didn't envision folks just sitting in an office all day, but going around that area, traveling, talking with folks at the local HBCU or at the local community college or the local vet center, right? I mean, really being the touch point for innovation in those communities. And I think candidly, and again, kudos to Director Vidal, I think that's the type of thing she wants PTO to be doing. I mean, we all know she's out there almost every day somewhere in the country talking about innovation. And so I think if we have those offices and the people in those offices are out there doing those type of things, that to me is a very real success, because those touch points could be the difference between someone giving up or sticking with it, getting their innovation to market. And again, who knows what that next big thing may be.
What I would add, I agree 100% with both sets of comments. What I would add is that in addition to the vision you have both laid out in terms of how you want to see the community outreach offices work, I think that there are things that all of us in this room can do, because we are all aware of various type of specific interest organizations that are the types of organizations that perhaps the community outreach officer needs to make a connection with. So for example, next week, I'm going to have some further conversations with the National Society of Black Engineers, right? Now, the community outreach officer, that person may not have a contact with NSBE, right? But those of us who have contacts with those types of organizations, we can help to make certain that the community outreach officer can be met halfway, right? That they don't have to scour the countryside to try to find how do I meet with, but we know where some of these people are. And we're also in a position to think creatively. Yes, we can think about the types of organizations that are involved in producing and creating, protecting IP from NSBE, Copyright Alliance, Authors Alliance, we can think about that. But we also are in a position to think creatively about other types of organizations. For example, churches. And when I speak sometimes before those groups, many people are surprised to find out, wait a minute, a gospel is subject to copyright. My sermon is subject to copyright. So there are lots of ways to go out into these underserved communities. And before the community outreach officer even gets there, we're like, oh, wait, no, we've come to you. And I think that's another thing that we can do to implement. And so with that, I think we are just a little bit over time. Quickly, did anybody have a particular question, comment, or anything that they wanted to share before we? I didn't want to leave any stone unturned. Anybody? And nothing online?
Can I build? I'll take
Great.
the speaker's prerogative. But to build on your point about getting out there in the community, I think that's absolutely right. And to getting into areas where we traditionally haven't thought about it. And so, for example, to your point, just because someone doesn't have a college degree or may work a blue collar job, right, or maybe didn't even finish high school, doesn't mean they can't be an innovator. We all know examples of folks who, didn't necessarily attain an educational, pedigree, but who had great ideas and products. So, making sure, right, that when we're talking about inclusive innovation, we mean everyone, right? And to your point, that's one area where advocacy groups, organizations can help PTO, the community outreach offices, is helping to identify those pockets of innovations, individuals who might fall through the gaps because for whatever reason, society has written them off based on totally, unobjective criteria. That doesn't mean they can't be the next big innovator. And so making sure we get those folks too.
Absolutely. Wonderful example of getting to see your tax dollars at work. Right? Scott Wilson of Spotify, Bradley Watts, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, thank you both for not only being here, but for making this bill happen. And now we got a whole new law. Now we're charged. Let's go out and do something. Thanks very much.